unique roller coaster.
Yeah.
This feeling of global shifts and uncertainty seems to be everywhere, and trying to get a handle on it can be, well...
More material comes from a really fascinating discussion at the Tsinghua PBCSF Global Finance Forum, specifically their panel on the challenges posed by global economic fragmentation.
Right, it was its expertise. We heard from a former deputy prime minister of Kazakhstan, a high-ranking figure from the China Society for Finance and Banking, the governor of Croatia's central bank, and the always insightful professor emeritus from NYU Stern, Nouriel Roubini. A really diverse and knowledgeable group.
Definitely.
So our job now is to pull out the most crucial insights on this complex topic. We're working from excerpts, basically a transcript from a YouTube recording of that live panel. So we're getting their direct thoughts on... Professor Django was moderating. Then you had Kirat Kelam, who's the former deputy PM of Kazakhstan.
Okay.
Orang, vice president of the China Society for Finance and Banking. Boris Vek, governor of Croatia's National Bank. And Nouriel Roubini, professor emeritus from NYU Stern. A real range of views.
Definitely. Okay, let's jump in. Kirat Kelam kicked things off, didn't he? Talking about just how much uncertainty policymakers are facing right now.
He really did. It feels like the ground's shifting under everyone's feet. He even used that Antonio Gramsci quote.
Oh, yeah, about the new world struggles to be born. Captures it perfectly.
It does. That feeling that the old system, that sort of rules-based system everyone talked about, is changing into something, well, less clear.
A bit unsettling, maybe. Kelam made a comparison, didn't he, to the start of the Great Depression.
He did, mentioning the tariff wars back then, how maybe the intentions were okay domestically, but the global result was, well, disastrous. Makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, is history repeating, or at least rhyming? He also noted this growing zero-sum game thinking.
That's a key point. The idea that for one country to win, another has to lose. It sort of undermines the whole idea of mutual benefit from trade and cooperation.
And he said something interesting about how country-to-country talks are starting to feel more like business deals, corporation to corporation.
Yeah, more transactional. Maybe less about the bigger picture, the diplomacy side.
Which brings us to a tough question. Who loses out most in that kind of shift?
Well, Kelam's warning was pretty stark for emerging markets. He suggested they could end up as collateral damage.
Oof, that's a worrying thought.
But he did balance it. He said that even in crisis, there can be opportunities. It's not all doom and gloom, potentially.
Right.
He described it pretty clearly as less economic consolidation. So the global economy becoming more segmented, more broken up into distinct parts, rather than one integrated system.
Less of a single market, more like separate zones.
Exactly. And he really wanted to tackle what he sees as misconceptions driving this, like that idea that countries with trade surpluses are somehow, stealing from countries with deficits.
That old argument. It pops up a lot, but economists often say it's more complicated than that.
For sure. And the other idea he challenged was that just imposing tariffs automatically helps your own country, brings manufacturing back, boosts reserves. He argued it's not that simple.
People argued this is a simplistic view. It ignores the flow of capital, the fact that trade deficits often fund investment in the deficit country,
Okay.
Another misconception is the idea that tariffs only hurt the country that's importing the goods. And the third is that when a country puts tariffs in place, it automatically benefits through companies moving production back home, reshoring, and positive effects on its currency. So he was calling for think tanks and researchers to step up, to debunk these ideas with solid evidence.
Yes, absolutely. He laid out key areas, like really understanding balanced trade, the long-term effects of surpluses and deficits, and also the massive question of what happens to world currency in this fragmented picture.
That's huge. And he mentioned how linked our industries are now, the value chains.
Yeah.
You can't easily separate them.
Right. And he also raised that really crucial point about blue-collar workers in advanced economies. Why have they faced hardship even when, productivity and costs might look similar elsewhere?
That gets into automation, globalization's distributional effects, a really complex issue.
Definitely. Onjing also warned about the potential downsides of trade barriers for the country imposing them. He mentioned, I think, the U.S. stock market and dollar devaluation in the past as examples.
So blowback is possible.
It seems so. And he posed that direct question. Why would a huge player like the U.S. impose tariffs that, seem to annoy so many others?
Good question. Okay, so how did Onjing suggest responding?
His perspective was framed around building a community of shared future of mankind. That's the overarching vision.
So more cooperation, less division.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
He stressed that globalization, in his view, is the big historical trend. Fragmentation. That's temporary, maybe harmful, the detour.
So stay the course on interconnectedness.
That's the message. And central to that is correcting those trade misconceptions we talked about, explaining the benefits, showing the costs of fragmentation.
He mentioned that Tsinghua motto, didn't he? Action speaks louder than words.
He did, urging active international exchange, sticking to China's central government policies, promoting global links.
And what about internally, within China?
He talked about continuing economic diversification, pushing technological innovation, and crucially, international cooperation on tech. He sees tech and productivity as huge drivers across the board.
Financial stability came up too, right?
Yeah, safeguarding markets through better coordination, building robust infrastructure, plus education, talent, policy coordination, communication, all key pieces.
But he also sounded a note of caution, preparing for the worst.
Well, yes. While emphasizing China isn't looking for conflict, he mentioned the need to be ready for tough scenarios. He used a Chinese proverb about not wanting to fight on all fronts simultaneously. Strategic preparedness, basically.
So resist protectionism based on what he sees as flawed ideas. Boris Beck brought in the history. That was useful.
Really useful. He used trade as a share of GDP to show the long-term picture.
Right. Trade went up before World War I, then crashed in the interwar years.
Exactly. The protectionist era, then surged again after World War II, right up until about 2009, the global financial crisis.
And that's a key point Beck made, isn't it? Since 2009, that upward trend in trade to GDP, it's stalled.
It stalled. And for emerging markets, it even dipped a bit. So this de-globalization narrative, maybe it's not entirely brand new. The peak might have been over a decade ago.
Interesting. And he linked trade growth to world GDP growth.
Yeah, showed that positive correlation. Historically, more trade meant more growth, generally speaking.
But it's not just the amount of trade, it's the pattern, right? The structure.
Precisely. Vec talked about the structural shifts, the decoupling we see now, like U.S.-China and Europe-Russia after the Ukraine invasion. It's a reshaping of who trades with who.
So the recent shocks are significant, but maybe they're accelerating trends that were already kind of simmering.
That's a fair reading of his point.
Yeah.
It provides a bit more context than just saying everything changed overnight.
Okay, what about the impact of tariffs? Did Vec offer specific numbers?
He mentioned some studies. The estimates suggest the long-run hit to GDP growth might be less severe for Europe compared to the U.S. from current trends. That's a potential difference.
And within Europe, who feels it most?
He pointed to Italy and Germany, likely due to their big manufacturing bases, feeling trade diversion impacts more. But interestingly, he also mentioned simulations suggesting a full China-U.S. trade stock wouldn't immediately cause, say, a massive collapse in euro area imports. Point about services, didn't he? Not just goods.
Yes, very important. Look at the U.S.-Euro area balance. It changes a lot when you include services trade. Focusing only on goods gives you a skewed picture.
Okay, let's talk inflation. Vec's view on tariffs and short-term inflation.
He suggested it might be relatively modest, but big caveat, it depends hugely on retaliation. If everyone slaps tariffs on everyone else, that's different.
Right. And he even said trade diversion within Europe could be deflationary short-term.
That was his point, yeah. Shifting suppliers might not immediately raise prices.
But the long term, that's different.
That's where the concern lies. De-globalization, he argued, could be inflationary long term. Why? Because resources get misallocated, supply chains become less efficient, productivity growth slows down. That tends to push costs up. Makes sense. And he brought in other long-term factors affecting inflation too.
He did. Demographics, the whole aging population debate, is it inflationary or deflationary? Decarbonization likely inflationary, he thought. Defense spending also inflationary. Digitalization may be deflationary in parts.
So a lot of cross currents.
Definitely. And he added that the big deflationary boost we got from integrating huge labor forces from China, Central, and Eastern Europe, that's probably over. That was a unique period.
Okay, shifting gears to Nouriel Roubini. He had a pretty strong take on why we're seeing this backlash against globalization, right? Challenging the simple narratives.
Yeah, he really pushed back on the idea that it just started recently with, say, Trump's tariffs. He argued the roots go back much further, like 25 years.
And what were those root causes, according to him?
Several things. First, the basic fact that globalization creates winners and losers, not just between countries, but within them. He used the China shock example, the impact on low-skilled manufacturing jobs in the U.S.
Right, the benefits weren't evenly spread.
Exactly. Second, geopolitics. He talked about a geopolitical recession or depression where security concerns, like the U.S.-China rivalry, start trumping pure economic efficiency.
Security over efficiency. Okay.
Third, he brought up that Roderick trilemma. You can't easily have hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and democracy all at once. He thinks countries are choosing sovereignty and democracy now, pulling back from hyperglobalization.
Interesting framework. What else?
Well, COVID. It just starkly revealed how fragile those long global supply chains could be, made everyone rethink reliance on distant suppliers for essential stuff.
The just-in-time model suddenly looked risky.
Very risky. Then there are the financial crises we've had over the decades. They've kind of weakened the case for totally free capital flows, haven't they? Made people more open to controls.
True. And the trade imbalances.
The persistent global imbalances, yeah. Countries running huge surpluses, others huge deficits, plus the ongoing anxiety about manufacturing job losses in developed nations. That fuels protectionist feelings.
And he mentioned migration.
The backlash against migration, yeah. Whatever the reasons, it's become a powerful political force, often tied into anti-globalization sentiment. And resource nationalism countries wanting more control over their own resources.
Inequality, too.
Big time. Rising income and wealth inequality, economic insecurity. He sees that as fertile ground for populism and nationalism, which are often skeptical of globalism.
And finally, the models.
The breakdown of the old Washington consensus, the free market recipe, and the rise of China's state capitalist model as a seemingly successful alternative. It shows there's not just one path anymore.
So Rubini's core point is, this isn't sudden. It's been building for a long time, driven by deep economic, social, and political factors.
Precisely. And his conclusion, hyperglobalization is over. We're moving towards de-globalization, regionalization, more focus on de-risking supply chains.
Not necessarily full decoupling everywhere, but pulling back in sensitive areas.
Exactly. And way more emphasis on security, which leads to more industrial policy, protectionism, subsidies, trying to bring production home, reshoring, or to friendly countries, friendshoring, tech rivalry. It's a different world.
Okay, that leads directly to the U.S.-China situation. Rubini sounded uncertain about whether the recent agreements are a real truce or just a pause.
Yeah, quite uncertain. He acknowledged some tariffs were reduced mutually, but pointed out the effective U.S. tariff rate on Chinese goods is still pretty high compared to history.
And he listed the U.S. complaints.
A long list. Tariffs, non-tariff barriers, IP theft, market access problems, government procurement rules favoring local firms, subsidies, currency issues, even fentanyl exports.
Wow. It's a lot. So achieving some kind of grand bargain seems tough.
Very tough, in his view. How do you de-risk the sensitive tech and security areas without triggering a much wider, more damaging split? That's the core dilemma.
So if a grand bargain is unlikely, what does Rubini see happening instead? Where does cooperation happen? He thinks the U.S. will likely double down on working with its existing friends and allies, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, the JCC group.
Strengthening those blocs.
Yeah. And that could mean, for instance, more pressure on European allies to increase defense spending, maybe beyond that 2% NATO target, and possibly buying more U.S. military gear.
Okay, what else?
More U.S. LNG going to Europe. More coordination on strategic industries, maybe like shipbuilding with India, Japan, South Korea.
And the U.S. might use tech access as leverage.
That's what he suggested, offering access to top U.S. tech, but maybe asking allies to pull back from China in sensitive tech areas in return, forcing a choice, potentially.
So more nearshoring and friendshoring seems baked in.
Definitely. He also mentioned currency appreciation in places like Europe and Japan could help rebalance things globally. And he was clear the U.S. wants to keep the dollar dominant, pushing back against de-dollarization efforts.
But despite all this fragmentation and rivalry, are there still areas where countries have to cooperate?
Rubini thinks so, and listed quite a few crucial ones. Global climate change is the obvious big one.
Can't solve that alone.
Nope. Also, setting limits on cyber warfare, nuclear nonproliferation, maybe China playing a role in the Russia-Ukraine situation.
What else?
Containing North Korea. Managing the Taiwan situation peacefully, restraint needed on all sides. International financial stability, that means reforming the IMF, World Bank, working through the FSC and BIS.
Trying to limit protectionism through trade deals.
Yeah, trying to find ways to manage trade tensions and reduce those big current account imbalances. Regulating AI that's huge and emerging. Preventing future pandemics.
So even with de-risking, try to avoid a total decoupling.
That's the hope. And he even mentioned cooperation in new frontier space, the Arctic, Antarctica, deep-sea mining, places where rules are still being written.
And he had a suggestion for China.
Yeah, basically saying China could boost its global influence by being more consistent in providing global public goods, contributing more to solving these shared problems.
Okay, let's bring it back to the panel specifics. The moderator asked Kellum directly about those Trump tariffs. How much did they drive fragmentation, and what was the impact on Kazakhstan?
Kellum largely agreed with the analysis so far, this sort of 3D view. But he made a distinction. It's not like the 1930s isolationism, he said. Everyone still kind of enjoys the benefits of globalization.
Right, nobody wants to completely cut themselves off.
Exactly. But he did say the big powers want to shape globalization their own way, get the benefits distributed how they see fit, and the definition of fairness in trade, that's shifted.
Different rules for different players, maybe?
Something like that. He also stressed how interconnected the U.S., China, and Europe still are. Decoupling is hard and hurts everyone. He mentioned China's role in providing cheaper goods and infrastructure, too.
And technology makes it even harder to disentangle.
Yeah, that was his point. Tech links everyone. So imposing tariffs can backfire, can be self-punishing. He also brought up Michael Spence's idea of this being a competitive game now, especially in tech and AI. That could create a tech divide.
And for countries like Kazakhstan, reliant on commodities.
Uncertainty is killer. Market volatility, low prices for oil, gas, minerals, agriculture. It hits them hard. His solution: more bilateral cooperation, focusing on specific mutual needs to navigate the tensions.
Okay, then the moderator turned back to onging about the U.S.-China deal, ceasefire, or just a temporary pause.
Ong Yin came back strongly on China's commitment to globalization. He mentioned China learned hard lessons from its own past history of being closed off.
Right, the closed-door policy period.
Exactly. And he noted the irony he felt that now some Western countries seem to be the ones closing doors.
So China sees itself as upholding globalization now.
That was the message. Sticking to principles like that community of shared future. Taking a dialectical view, seeing conflicts, but also opportunities. The key things for him were mutual respect and mutual benefit.
He shared an anecdote, too.
Yeah, about an elderly woman's wisdom on everyone doing well together, collective well-being. And he reiterated China's determination, pointing to things like the Belt and Road Initiative as sincere efforts.
Okay, then the focus shifted to Croatia and Boris Vek. Joining the Eurozone amidst all this fragmentation, how do you balance national needs with Eurozone goals?
Vek made a strong case that for a small, open economy like Croatia, adopting the euro just made sense.
Why? What were the benefits?
Lower borrowing costs internationally was a big one. And crucially, eliminating foreign exchange risk. That's a huge headache for small economies, he argued.
Especially during crises, right? He mentioned COVID.
Exactly. Managing currency risk when things get turbulent is really tough if you're small. He even questioned how much real monetary policy independence small open economies actually have anyway.
How so?
He used the example of the ECB's quantitative easing. Even before Croatia joined the euro, they basically had to follow suit to manage their own currency. The idea of going your own way was limited.
And Croatia's goals align with the EU's anyway.
Largely, yes. Especially on things like digitalization, renewable energy. He talked about Croatia's economy shifting to less traditional industry, more IT focused now.
And clean energy advantages.
Yeah, hydro, nuclear, co-owned, growing solar and wind. Plus, their LNG terminal is strategically important for the region's energy security. He painted a picture of strong growth since joining the EU. Integration worked for them.
Okay, last big topic, the U.S. dollar. The moderator asked Rubini about de-dollarization. Is the dollar losing its dominance? What does that mean for emerging markets?
Rubini started by acknowledging, yeah, you see the headlines, talk about de-dollarization driven by sanctions, the weaponization of the dollar, maybe damage to the U.S. brand as a neutral anchor.
Finding an alternative is hard.
That's the crux of it. He echoed Larry Summers, where else are you going to go? Finding a currency with all the necessary features of a global reserve currency is really difficult.
What are those features again?
Flexible exchange rate, no capital controls, rule of law, deep liquid capital markets, historically a current account deficit to supply the currency. That dollar ticks a lot of those boxes.
And the renminbi, the RMB.
Rubini pointed out limitations there, like capital controls and exchange rate management. He also argued the main benefit of having the reserve currency, geopolitically, is the power to impose financial sanctions.
So despite the talk, he doesn't see the dollar collapsing soon.
He seemed skeptical of a rapid decline. He mentioned American exceptionalism. Maybe a potential U.S. investment boom could actually support the dollar.
But rivals are trying to reduce reliance.
Oh, definitely. China, Russia, the BRICS group, they want alternatives for payments.
Oh.
They're exploring alternatives to SWIFT. China's pushing its digital currency, CBDC. Europe wants a bigger role for the euro, too.
And how might the U.S. respond?
Maybe things like tokenized deposits, stablecoins. He also touched on the practical issues China faces. If it tries to dump its U.S. Treasury holdings, huge potential losses, upward pressure on the RMB.
What about gold? Its price has been rising.
He linked that partly to central banks wanting liquid assets they control, assets that can't easily be seized, a hedge against geopolitical risk.
But decoupling fully from the U.S. banking system, still hard.
Very hard, he argued. It's just so deeply embedded globally. Finally, he noted there isn't always a single, clear U.S. policy on the dollar's strength or its reserve role. Different parts of the government might have different views.
Right. Okay, wrapping this up. This deep dive really shows just how complex this whole economic fragmentation picture is. There are clearly no easy answers here.
Not at all. But we've heard from a great range of experts bringing different global perspectives.